The story begins with a young boy playing soccer on a quiet beach in Mexico. It's almost dark and no one else is around. Suddenly, the boy spots a helmet with a GoPro camera attached. Curious, he picks it up and plays the first video. It shows two surfers having a great time in the sun until a huge shark attacks them, tearing them apart. The boy is horrified by their screams and runs away immediately. Next, the story flashes back to 2 days earlier. An American tourist named Nancy Adams is on her way to the same beach. In a conversation with her driver Carlos, we learn that Nancy was once an aspiring medical student, but after her mother's recent death from cancer, she decided to change her career plans. Nancy also shares that her mother got pregnant on this beach, making it a special place for her. After some time, they arrive at the beach. It's as beautiful as Nancy had imagined, and nearly empty except for a few local surfers. Once the driver leaves, Nancy quickly changes into her swimming gear and readies her surfboard, which belonged to her mother. She then dives into the sea and starts paddling towards the waves. A bit further out, Nancy meets two friendly local surfers. They engage in a brief conversation where one surfer tells her about the dangerous jellyfish in the area. He also mentions that the reef appears only when the tide is low, creating a temporary island. After this exchange, they all start surfing. Nancy proves to be quite skilled, carving through the waves like a pro. A few hours later, the surfers get tired and decide to head back to shore. However, Nancy wants to enjoy the ocean a bit longer and tells them she'll stay for a few more hours. She bids them goodbye and watches them leave. After some time, Nancy heads back to the shore to take a break. She uses this moment to call her sister and father. Her sister teases her, feeling jealous that Nancy is at a secret beach. Their conversation reveals they have a good relationship. Nancy then speaks with her father, who urges her not to quit med school despite her mother's passing. This call gives more insight into Nancy's recent struggles and her decision to change careers. Feeling refreshed, Nancy gets ready for one last surf. While she gets ready, her sister looks at the pictures Nancy sent earlier and notices a shark's fin in one of them. She immediately tries to call Nancy back, but Nancy has already gone into the water. As Nancy paddles out, she senses something in the water. However, it turns out to be a pod of dolphins, which captivates Nancy with their playful jumping. Mesmerized by their beauty, she decides to follow them. After a few minutes, Nancy notices the sea is filled with blood. She realizes it's coming from a dead whale, likely hunted a few days ago. Understanding a predator must be nearby, Nancy gets on her surfboard and starts paddling towards safety. Unfortunately, the shark notices her. It strikes the surfboard, sending her tumbling violently through the churning water. Somehow, Nancy manages to get back on her board, but the shark grabs her leg and pulls her under. The predator is revealed to be a colossal great white shark. In the struggle, Nancy's leg is badly wounded, turning the water around her red. Despite the injury, she escapes and climbs onto the whale carcass. She screams to other surfers for help, but no one is close enough to hear her, leaving her stranded and helpless. The shark, still intent on its prey, starts ramming the whale, nearly knocking Nancy into the water. She decides to find a safer place to hide. She sees two options: a buoy floating in the distance and a reef emerging due to the low tide. Although she knows the reef will be submerged again by the next day, Nancy chooses it as her refuge. Just before the shark rams the carcass again, she dives into the water and swims towards the reef, with the shark in pursuit. Nancy makes it to the reef, where she encounters another victim of the shark, a wounded seagull. It had been on the whale carcass when the shark attacked. Sympathizing with the bird, Nancy focuses on her own survival. To stop the bleeding in her leg, she uses her jewelry to perform a makeshift operation. She screams in pain but manages to stitch up the wound and bandage it with her wetsuit, preventing infection. As night falls, the temperature drops and it becomes extremely cold. Nancy does some more modifications to her wetsuit, turning it into a makeshift jacket for warmth. Meanwhile, the resilient seagull looks at Nancy with disapproving eyes, as if thinking she's weak. Later in the night, Nancy and the seagull bond while eating crabs they catch on the reef. At one point, Nancy notices her surfboard floating not too far away. Hoping the shark is gone, she slowly enters the water to retrieve it. However, after swimming for a few minutes, she sees the menacing fin of the great white shark still nearby. Using the last of her strength, she gets back on the reef but injures her leg again. At this point, Nancy feels like giving up. The reef will disappear in a few hours due to the rising tide, and her worsening wound might be fatal. Just then, she spots a ray of hope. A drunk man passed out on the beach. Not far from her, she screams for help. The man wakes up and Nancy instructs him to use her phone, which is in her bag, to call for help. The man seems to comply, but upon checking the bag, greed takes over. He takes out all her cash, pockets her phone, and prepares to leave. Noticing the surfboard floating in the water, he decides to steal that too. Despite his actions, Nancy repeatedly warns him of the danger. Ignoring her, he wades into the water and reaches the surfboard, but before he can return, the shark attacks and kills him. Nancy can only watch in horror, realizing there is no way out. The next morning, Nancy is woken by water splashes, signaling the rising tide. The reef will sink completely in a few hours, and she needs to find a way to escape. Suddenly, she sees the two surfers from the previous day arriving at the beach. They notice Nancy on the reef and start approaching her on their surfboards. Nancy tries to warn them about the shark, but they think she's joking. Tragically, the shark leaps out of the water and attacks one of the surfers. Witnessing this, his friend panics and swims towards Nancy. He makes it to the reef, but the shark drags him down into the depths before Nancy can pull him up. Nancy is left alone again. Deciding that she has to stay strong to see her family, Nancy is horrified by the sight of the surfer dying in front of her. After a while, she picks up the gull and starts tending to its wounds. At first, the seagull bites her, clearly annoyed, but eventually it calms down. As Nancy searches for ways to get off the reef, she notices the second surfer's helmet with a GoPro attached, the same one seen at the start of the story. Despite the shark still circling, Nancy decides to retrieve it. She uses her watch to calculate the time it takes for the shark to complete one rotation around the reef, 30 seconds. Timing it perfectly, Nancy dives into the water and grabs the GoPro without any issue. But on her way back, the shark chases her. She manages to get back on the reef, but the shark attempts to leap onto the surface to catch her. Fortunately, the sharp rocks and poisonous plants repel it back into the water. Nancy now has something that might help her, the GoPro. As she reviews the recent footage, she spots a metal piece, resembling a fishing hook, lodged in the side of the shark's mouth. This injury likely explains the shark's aggressive behavior. She records a heartfelt message for her family, urging them to stay strong if she doesn't survive. She also records a plea for help. Once finished, she tosses the GoPro into the sea, hoping it will reach the shore and someone will see her message. An hour later, it is almost noon, and the high tide will soon sweep the reef away. Nancy realizes she must reach the buoy 100 meters away, despite knowing the shark will likely catch up to her. Before diving in, she places the seagull on a broken piece of the surfboard and sends it away, hoping the waves will carry it to shore. As Nancy prepares to dive into the water, she notices hundreds of jellyfish swimming nearby. Remembering the surfers mentioned how dangerous they are, she decides to use them as a shield against the shark. Swimming through the jellyfish, the shark doesn't come near her, seemingly terrified of the jellies. Nancy reaches the buoy, but as she climbs, the handle breaks, causing her to fall back into the water. The shark arrives, and it looks like it's going to attack, but Nancy bravely stabs it with a piece of metal, giving her enough time to climb back onto the buoy. After this, Nancy looks through a hidden compartment in the buoy and finds a flare gun. She immediately fires it into the sky to call for help, but no one seems to be around. By this time, the shark has become very aggressive, repeatedly banging on the buoy. It is only a matter of minutes before it sinks. With time running out, Nancy devises another plan. She notices the nearby whale carcass leaking oil, so she fires the remaining flare into the ocean. The water ignites, setting the shark on fire. The massive beast struggles for a while, but then dives underwater, extinguishing the flames. It appears nothing can put it down. Meanwhile, on the shore, the boy who was playing soccer at the start of the story finally finds the GoPro. After watching the videos, he runs to call for help. Back at the buoy, the shark has become even more aggressive, constantly ramming it. Bit by bit, it disintegrates the large structure and eventually takes it off balance. Nancy clings on for dear life, with only a small piece of metal between her and the shark. At one point, the buoy goes underwater, and Nancy notices the anchor holding it at the bottom of the sea. The anchor is made of several sharp rods, giving her another idea. While the shark is still attacking the buoy, Nancy disconnects the chain. The heavy chain pulls her towards the ocean floor. The shark notices and follows her. Nancy makes her final move, letting go of the chain at the last second. She misses the sharp anchor by inches, but the shark is not so lucky, getting pierced and killed instantly. In the next moment, the boy arrives with his father, who is the driver from earlier. He spots a lifeless Nancy on the shore and immediately administers CPR. Fortunately, she woke up a few seconds later. Even the gull is there, cheering from the sidelines. As she opens her eyes for a moment, Nancy sees a vision of her mother smiling down at her. Following this, the story cuts to 1 year later. Nancy is at a beach in Texas, healed from her injuries, with only a few scars on her legs. She has resumed her studies and is on her way to becoming a doctor. The story ends with Nancy and her sister jumping into the sea, laughing and smiling.